tip of this iceberg of challenges and of course opportunities in the next 30 minutes, because it is a huge conversation, but we certainly look forward to shedding some light, or rather I look forward to the speakers shedding some light. I've got two excellent speakers with me today. So just before we delve into that main topic of the day, NOCs, their road to net zero, I'd like each of the speakers to give their opinion on the list of stories which should be showing on your screen. Now these are the top 10 stories that we've highlighted from the last week that we think are particularly interesting and particularly relate to our key meat of the day topics. So Faris Al Kharusi, he is the Principal Business Transformation Lead at Petroleum Development Oman. Also, of course, we all know that as PDO. Faris, thank you very much for joining us again. Which story would you choose, please?
Thank you, Michelle. To just jump into it, I really like sort of the collation of energy giants selling off assets. The regional NOCs. It's an interesting picture into how, and I think there was a quote within the article about trying to monetize without taking on debt. And I think that's probably going to be sort of the strategy or the medium-term strategy for most of these NOCs going forward, because they're such huge drivers and engines for these governments in these regions. So any opportunity now after this recovery, you've got a $70 barrel or so. Yeah, they would definitely like to subsidize some of these transformational activities if they can without incurring any more red on the ledger. Yeah.
Absolutely, and this isn't that long after 2014 when the oil price truly collapsed, and there were budget saving measures, some rather significant, some 6,000 redundancies for one of the NOCs, made within 1 year. I mean, that's steep. And that's only 2014, and now they're facing another huge upheaval. And like you say, the idea is to not take on more debt, and that's especially the case of some of the assets that we're seeing going away with the threat of stranded assets. So, for example, Saudi Arabia and UAE in that story are leading the trend. April, Saudi Aramco agreed to sell 49% of its pipeline network to a US-led consortium for $12.4 billion. June last year, Abu Dhabi's ADNOC raised 10 billion selling gas pipeline leasing rights. And it's interesting the sorts of assets that they're selling when we have news from Financial Times' Lex and others as well, saying that the risk of stranded assets is heading well into the trillions already. So do you think that these sorts of headlines and these stranded assets concerns are also very much part of this push?
Yeah, I think if you listen to some of the influencers and some of the sort of the oil ministers in the region, they're always speaking about they're trying to hedge their bets by saying, we don't want to rush very heavily into what some people might consider still a little bit of and the Guardian article talks about the pledges, very well, but they don't want to rush too aggressively into this transformation journey. But at the same time, they do want to feel like if the train is going to leave the station, they don't want to be the last person or last country or last NOC in the group that is a laggard in this activity. So I think that's part of it too,
I'm glad you bring that up, because that's something I want to touch on later as well, is how to find that balance, because we're seeing in terms of that pullback in investments on some of the traditional energy markets, but perhaps there's not seeing the rise of the low carbon resource to the scale that we need in order to plug that, and where that leaves us with energy security. So I certainly like to come back to that. Thank you very much. Trung Ghi is a partner and head of the energy and utilities at Arthur D. Little, ADL, in Asia Pacific. Trung, thank you again for joining us. Which story jumps out at you with neon lights?
In fact, like you said, all of them are very interesting, but I really wanted to touch upon the job growth, fivefold globally by 2050. It's quite a good timing actually for us to discuss this, given the whole pandemic situation as well. Economic recovery really is quite important for us if we wanted to get out of certain situations. And if you look at historically with the depression and so forth, governments really need to put in the effort to have infrastructure, whether it be building bridges or dams, back in those days. Today it's going to be about building infrastructure for renewable. And if we have these net zero ambitions across the world, jobs such as renewables, will be quite key. You'll be upskilling a lot of people, like say digital world, and the consulting work that we're doing today have really changed. A lot of our topics are now talking about what is the workforce of the future look like. And so if we don't start thinking about this, planning for NOCs, IOCs, and various other companies, even the ministries, I think we won't get into the recovery that we will get later on. So. Yeah.
And there's almost three pressure points, isn't there, on the talent pool? You've got decarbonisation, as you mentioned, you've got digitalisation as well. We're seeing this gap rather fast emerging, where we just don't have the number of ICT specialists and within that data scientists and so on that we need. And then also the pandemic driven forces, where a rise in remote working demands, and we've already been seeing for a long time from the younger generations, they want more flexibility, they want more autonomy over their roles, and the whole idea of a career is completely transformed. But the pandemic and digitalization have just made that soar. I mean, it's you know, heading towards the stratosphere in terms of how fast that shift was going to accelerate. How on top of it do you think NOCs are? I mean, of course, that's a huge question. Every NOC is different, but if you were to generalize, do you think that they are keeping pace with this rate of change, or is it's just simply too fast over the last year, especially?
I wouldn't say it's just NOCs, but I think in my view, there's NOCs in different regions that have potentially greater brand power. If I look at, say, in Asia, for example, where are a lot of the jobs going these days would be in the branding, right? So if you get into the larger firms, such as, say, NOCs, you'll be making quite a good career out of that. Then you have those that are into more startups and entrepreneurial. And so that's where a lot of the next generations are thinking about. And so how do NOCs really need to think about, or even IOCs think about the workforces? Do we go head on and try and attract these sort of players or people as well, and transform the way we think about workforce? And this is where I think it's the most interesting part of the transformation we're going to see in the next 5-10 years. And the energy transition is going to just accelerate this thinking, plus the whole digitization. And then you also got convergence and decentralization. So imagine now we're not looking at petroleum engineers as our workforce. We need to think about many different types of people we need to hire. Otherwise, we'll never get there. Right.
And people with skill sets that's, you know, increasingly key, that perhaps weren't in the past as well. It's just it's certainly not just volume, is it? It's the style of that volume as well. Faris, I'd be interested.
New jobs. Sorry.
Indeed. I think WEF said something along the lines of up to 50% of the roles that will exist by 2050 onwards. We don't know what they're called yet. We don't even know that they exist. And if we look at some of the job roles now, would there have been a chief digital officer? Would there have been social media analysts 10 years ago? No. We're just going to see that accelerate. So it's very exciting, and to see how it's all going to play out. But for those in the hiring seat, I suspect it's exciting and also a little bit confusing at the moment. Faris, from your point of view with business transformation, how much of a key point is this, the talent point? And also obviously with as part of PDO and nationalization targets, as we're seeing across the Middle East and many other countries as well, how important is this? How do you see it evolving?
So it's a very good question. And I think back about one of the position papers I developed for the government within, 10 days. I threw it together and sent it to our national think tank unit here. And the core part of my sort of concern when I discussed that particular item when it comes to 4IR is you cannot copy and paste at what is happening in a typical OECD type country in Western Europe or North America to what's happening in Middle East and North Africa, because we have such a regulatory and legal difference between those countries and ours, where, for example, and we got to be very transparent about it. In this region, we have, for example, a highly unskilled labor force that is mostly expatriate, from different parts of Asia and different parts of the other parts of the world. And if we're worried about automation, 4IR impact, reskilling, retooling, those individuals are going to be the ones who unfortunately bear the brunt of it. It's not going to be the person, the reservoir engineer or the geophysicist sitting in front of his computer in the office who is going to feel the early stages of that pain in terms of that changing and transformational economy. So the skills we need are usually going to impact the ones, unfortunately, who are the most vulnerable among us in society. So that's one issue. But the other issue is more to the point is when policymakers and executives of many of these companies are looking for advice, it's hard to frame that advice when you're trying to do it in an environment where there is no data to do forecasting. So one of the things we wanted to do was look at, well, all right, how many individuals of this engineering discipline or this natural science discipline is going to be impacted in 5, 10, 15 years from now? Who do we need to recruit from universities and schools? How should we advise local colleges and universities to prepare for that?
And just to interject there, how to advise them when, as Trung just said, we still aren't quite sure what they're going to need to know as well. So
absolutely. And Trung's point on all NOCs being very different is true, because some NOCs have on their assets books, let's say, non-conventional aging hydrocarbon assets. Others, are maybe very gas oriented in terms of their assets. And the reality is each of them have different unit cost considerations where some of the countries in the region, they have cutoff points of $25, $30 barrels in terms of their profitability, and others have 5 or 10, which means you have a lot of leeway to place on where you can put your investment. So that's that all comes into the interplay, and you can't go to, and I don't want to use any third-party consultancies or international agencies, which I respect, but you can't go to them for advice because they themselves are only harvesting data from organizations probably in North America or Europe or elsewhere in the more developed world, most likely to formulate strategies over there. It's not copy and paste for what's required here locally. Yeah.
So we have this black hole of information really when it comes to large swathes of local talents as part of this decarbonisation conversation, and we've already mentioned there's other triggers as well, digitalisation and post-pandemic. How does that impact NOC's road to net zero? Without the ideas, there's only so much progress that can be made. The brains behind the projects, that varies, very true, brain and brawn. How does that impact having this black hole when it comes to the talent pool? How worried should we be?
I think, you see, when I see organizations, and then Trung can speak to this probably a little bit better than me, because on the utility side, they're more sensitive to this. But when I see organizations making 30-year plans, and with such definitive forecasting, those 30-year plans, I wonder how realistic they are being about it. Because at the speed of change and with all this legacy infrastructure in place, we don't know if things like edge technology are going to be something that is widely adopted in the next 3 years or the next 10 years. It all comes down to how many of these technologies diminish in pricing. I mean, if these technologies become incredibly cheaper, it's not Moore's law for computing, and from that point of view, it's more actually from the point of view of the reality is how much is it going to cost to deploy overall? And I think we touched on this before, is it's going to be quite a challenge for them to keep to those sort of 30-year targets, because reality is they will have to follow what the industry is already offering them in totality, So if they need to replace rigs, if they need to replace data acquisition systems, if they need to replace data sensing systems so they can accurately monitor how much energy consumption is happening in different parts of industrial processes. All of this will come down to what is available at that time when a decision for investment is made.
They're essentially on the decarbonisation river, and they've got their destination to 2030, 2040 and so on, and they're heading in the right direction, but they'll very much be affected by the currents and the rocks in the way and so on, and rather than this ideal that they'll be going in a straight line down this river unaffected by
you know better than me when you monitor these things. I mean, it wasn't very long ago that we were talking about 5G as being a very politicized infrastructure investment, and which organizations, where and where not, who was going to be the leader in that. And nothing connected to the economy, nothing connected to regulation actually impacted the rollout of many of these technologies. It came down to basic politics and national security considerations. And so you see that's got nothing to do with what the environment needs or what even the economy needs. It's just totally decoupled from the conversation, Yeah.
Indeed. And just to look at the broader picture of NOCs, Trung, I'm keen to get your view on this. So NOCs, obviously, they play a major role in the global oil and gas space, and we should be very grateful to them as well for, as I always say, these traditional energy markets are the reason that billions of people enjoy the level of civilization that we do enjoy. And that is the case over the last 100 years. Yes, it absolutely needs to change. Should have probably changed a little sooner, but still, there's a nod of thanks there to get to where we are. But at the moment, it's 50% of liquids worldwide, 80% of gas worldwide all come from NOCs. But we're seeing, as we know, this huge shift where more than 20% of the world's largest corporates, not just NOCs, worth sales more than $14 trillion have now committed to net zero targets. This is from a recent report from the ECIU and Oxford Net Zero. So Trung, against that picture, how strong is that spotlight beaming on NOCs that haven't, because some have, but that haven't put down net zero pledges, and obviously their associated governments? How strong is that? Is it, from my perspective, it seems to be increasingly questionable. People are curious and some are critical as to why that hasn't happened. Is that how you feel it's playing out?
Yeah, it's a nice debate to have. And in fact, when you do the analysis of it, we just did a project for a national oil company here, and they were asking us how much investment should we have to do all this. The government has not pledged anything. Even like Australia, we haven't said anything for 2050 yet, right? We're a resource nation, so we needed to keep this alive. And so where is the debate going? If you think about it, how much of even the international oil companies are putting in investments of their total revenue? Potentially maybe 5, 8, 6%, or maybe even up to 10%. But where is the rest of that going to? They still need to keep this cash flow going, and they're setting themselves up, obviously, for the next 10 years or so. So yes, we don't know what the straight line is, but you know where the vision is, the strategy is, and where you get there and how you get there is a different story. Like Faris was saying, right? It's here and now. But unless we have that vision, I don't think we will be able to say how much to invest in. So we did a really top-down approach for them, and we said that if, for example, you take 2050 as your milestone and you want to hit the net zero, regardless of what the government says, these are the sort of things you need to be thinking about over the next 5, 10 years. Things will move around. So the pressure, I would say, in certain regions are not as strong. And in fact, the core business of some of the Asian national oil companies are still going to be in the fossil fuel. They will play a part in the decarbonization, but it's only to do with reducing carbon dioxide from the air or sequestering down to the ground, converting it to something else, right, as a new business. But to go into where the Europeans are playing in terms of renewable green energy, it's still far away. I think they'll be following for a while. We won't be leading. And so I think there's going to be different spotlights, Michelle, on various companies.
Different spotlights on the same stage, maybe. And just before we go to our first question, Trung, as well, just survey question. I just also want to get your view on the social impact. Obviously, NOCs, they wear two hats. They're commercial entities, and they're also social champions, national champions as well. as we're seeing more pressure from the public, from communities on the sort of products they want to consume and how they use their energy, and also on a corporate basis, as we saw in the Hague with Shell not very long ago, do you see maybe the pressure for NOCs to look at net zero, because it's such a headline phrase for the public? Of course, we know that you can make huge amounts of progress without net zero as well, but as a public statement, net zero grabs headlines and it grabs customers' attention. Do you think that we'll start seeing customers putting more pressure on NOCs to go that route?
Yeah, I think even beyond the NOCs, any state-owned enterprises, whether you're an oil company or utility company or whichever large company within that country, will see some pressure. The generation today, like ourselves as well, we're really keen on sustainable travel, sustainable living, everything sustainable these days, right? Whatever we can do to support. Look at also single-use plastic these days. It's banning everywhere. China doesn't even want to take anyone else's rubbish, right? So you can see that the shift in the mindset, and the pressure will come. How much of the pressure, again, is a different spotlight, and how much investments will happen really boils down to then the government putting in the right policies, removing certain subsidies, introducing certain carbon credits or taxes. Otherwise, these mega projects for CCUS or hydrogen in certain regions would never pick up unless the technology gets much better. But that will take another 10 years, for example, right?
And I would argue on that carbon pricing point that you just made as well. We had 2 carbon pricing initiatives in 1990 according to the World Bank, and now we have 64 worldwide. That's 31 years, and you could. Yes, that is absolutely progress, but that progress needs to triple in the next 10 years if we're to be on track. And for newer markets like green hydrogen, obviously it's not new, but new in the modern way that we're thinking of it now, and the role that it can play in our modern energy ecosystem, in order for those sorts of markets to progress as many wish. I think a carbon pricing initiatives, not on a global basis, I don't think that's possible, but on a regional supply chain basis is definitely going to have to come in. Let's bring up that first survey question, please. I'm keen to hear your answer. I'll come to you first, Faris, after you've had a chance to vote. So in 2022, NOCs without net zero pledges will start to fall behind energy players with net zero pledges. So NOCs without, and then energy players. So as Trung's mentioned, it's the whole ecosystem. It's IOCs, it's other private entities, it's utilities, and so on. So keen to know how much of a difference these 2 words will make for NOCs over the next year. Faris, what's your opinion? Does it matter as much as we think it does?
Oh God, it's a loaded question. I'm pretty sure there are a couple of people from my corporate affairs and communications department watching this right now and saying
the
you
answer
have
is
no
disagree.
right. Yeah, I'm going to feed me the answer. No, I think it's very difficult, because I feel like this is a question about overall speed as opposed to just what happens next year. So I've seen organizations leapfrog others when they have been laggards in adoption of various different kinds of technologies and various kinds of initiatives. So, and part of that is because some countries don't have to deal with regulations. I mean, I'm in the region here in the GCC, there is a significant amount of lack of regulation in a lot of areas. And that can be a bad thing, but that can also be a very good thing, because it allows the freedom to aggressively adopt technologies, maybe using some shortcuts that they wouldn't have to go through the red tapes that you'd find in, California or, Washington State when it comes to solar adoption or whatever. So I feel like to answer the question very directly, it's important that all NOCs have a vision, a clear vision that is not just based on symbolism, but is based on some key metrics. And they have to be honest with both their own sort of, shareholders, stakeholders, about what are the limitations of their own, transformation constraints. Because at the end of the day, a hydrocarbon organization can only be part of that journey so much. It's so much, it depends on demand, supply, what are the other options?
Those rocks and currents that we were talking about.
Yeah, so I mean, it's hard to put it all on the NOCs themselves. Supply chain is one area that I'm not, looking to deflect. But there was a very interesting article, I think it was by BCG last year, where they looked at the different industries, retail, utilities, hydrocarbons, and they basically saw that in terms of GHGs and carbon dioxide, actually, as a secondary issue, supply chain management and logistics is where a lot of the problem lies. Yes, being a primary producer of hydrocarbons is an issue, but there is so much more that goes into the economy than just that. And then also, I mean, to wrap it up, is if you look at the last, and I wrote this in an article that I posted on LinkedIn a few weeks back, is if you look at the history of hydrocarbons globally over the last 150 years, I mean, 3/4 or even 80% of consumption comes from, China, Europe, mostly North America. There's another part of the world that hasn't had the chance, as we've heard many, many times before, hasn't had the chance to go through that journey. And now they're being asked to very expensively take on the costs of transformation while they're having growth opportunities. So
I mean, that's very much the push and pull of all the UNFCCC COPs for the last 15 years, isn't it? It is that exact point. Is what
absolutely.
And
I mean, absolutely. And I know it's I don't want to make it about the first world and the developing world or whatever, but the reality is, if we are supposed to believe that this is one planet, then the costs need to be shared proportionately and fairly too. It can't be just about where a supplier or somebody who's demanding that change, who has now benefited from that and has the technology and has the infrastructure and has the the skill sets and base to move on in terms of their economies, get to dictate those discussions. So I agree.
It's not a case. You say I don't want to make it a case of that, but it is indeed that is the case. And when it comes to energy security, that those are certainly the facts, that there are these different platforms. We can use the different spotlights that Trung mentioned earlier as well. Just use that description as well, that there are, and that there is this inequality brewing as we make progress in this decarbonisation journey, that the have and the have-nots, as we were discussing before we went live, that chasm is getting larger and larger for multiple reasons. We talked about digitalization and the pandemic and vaccinations and as well, but decarbonisation is another one of those reasons, with these price tags being put on nations that disproportionately so I mean, that links to that energy security point that I wanted to loop back to, actually, because at the moment we have just over 1 billion people worldwide, and these are official figures, of course. It could be much higher, who don't have reliable access to power. And we're in 2021. That is less than it was 5 years ago, but it's still pretty high, over 1 billion people on the planet. And now we're seeing not just NOCs, of course, but energy companies on a broader level beginning to pull back on some of their spending on the traditional energy forms, amid talk of peak oil being within the decade, amid, of course, the demand destruction we saw last year, though it is now recovering. So we're seeing a pullback on some of those traditional energy markets with more of a focus on the renewables and low carbon. Now, of course, this is to be lauded in many ways, but at the same time, are those lower carbon energy markets ready to fill the gap? I don't think so. I'll wait for your opinion, of course. But is there a risk here that we're just, and Trung, I'd love to hear your comments here, is there a risk that we are amplifying that energy security risk for certain nations that are already vulnerable, while more privileged nations continue on their decarbonisation journey and continue to tick their boxes because they're more developed when it comes to low carbon resources?
And that's exactly right, Michelle. I mean, from my point of view, if you think about what the Western world is doing for renewable decarbonization, they got the luxury of this liberalized market for generating power. But then you got those that don't have, like you said, over 1 billion that don't even have electricity. And so the technology, for me, if I was to sum it up as a key takeaway, if we all can think about R&D technology investing, regardless of what it is, whether to bring down costs for solar or wind, or even how to connect different rural areas together with microgrids and so forth. That would be the number one thing I would pledge everyone to start thinking about. Yes, we want hydrogen, we want all green and so forth, but there's also things that we need to think about to connect everyone together. And we haven't yet done that. Slowly getting there, but I feel that we're not putting enough effort into the R&D. A few years ago, right, we saw the US plummeting their R&D spend compared to, say, 10, 20 years ago. What about now? Can we see something different with the new administration? So I'd like to see that moving forward, if that was a key takeaway.
Yes.
And we're going to bring up the last question. It's on hydrogen. We're going to have to do it as a rapid fire one, but I'm just keen to hear your thoughts on it. But as you were saying, Trung, just now, that very much links to what Faris was mentioning at the beginning of energy leaders saying in the Middle East and beyond, as well, and other countries as well, saying, you know, we're on board, but let's just be sensible about this. We can't leave swathes of the population unprovided for just so that we can tick, essentially, for some, political peacocking boxes. We can't say, you know, we've done everything right, look how great we are in the media, but actually we have 500 million people who are over the next 10 years are going to significantly be disadvantaged by not being provided for properly. So if we could bring up that survey question, please. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. I think there's still so much to say, but if we bring up the survey question, and then I'll quickly get your thoughts on it. So NOCs are talking the talk when it comes to ramping up green hydrogen. Of course, as we know, green hydrogen is increasingly a key part of decarbonisation plans and for net zero for those who have those targets, but they have yet to fully walk the walk. So agree or disagree? Faris, where do you stand on this, please? Just a quick summary, and then I'll go to Trung and we'll have to wrap up, unfortunately.
So generally, overall, globally and regionally, I would say disagree. Where they have done good work, and that includes the IOCs in this, is usually in purchase or acquisition of hydrogen startups or hydrogen initiatives, or co-opting them sometimes. But that really doesn't, that's not on their own initiative. Being able to buy somebody else's good idea or invest in somebody else's good idea has shown that you were just sitting on capital and you just wanted to find a quick win. But I would like to, I've seen some fantastic work. Some of my friends from university do things on predictive usage using machine learning and neural networks of battery technology for hydrogen storage over the last year or two or three. And things like that, especially off-grid, is just fascinating and could lead to getting to the last mile that you discussed, you mentioned earlier, those individuals who don't have that kind of access. So there is opportunity there. And Trung said about, years of US administration underfunding. I think this administration is serious about reversing some of that historical sort of underfunding, because they keep on mentioning China as a strategic challenger, or whatever, however they want to word it in terms of strategic competitor or whatever. But the reality is they know at the end of the day, the individuals and the economies that are most prepared for this change are most likely once again going to be leaders in the next generation economies that they want to basically dominate. So so there it is.
Brilliant, thank you, Faris. And Trung, what are your thoughts?
My thought is that they're in the right direction. If I was to say yes or no, that yes, I agree with the statement. There could be more to be done. It's just, I think there is that double-edged sword you mentioned. They need that energy security. Where would they put the investment versus the green energy? Now, that's where the question is. And if policy is put in place, I think the investment will be slightly different. People still need fossil fuels somehow, and electricity needs to be run. So they don't have that same luxury.
It's an extremely delicate balance, isn't it? And I think it'd be fascinating to see how it plays out, even in the next 6 months, to see how, obviously we're talking decades, this is a journey we'll be talking about for decades and decades, but how it plays out in the next 6 months with the growing pressure on these companies, not just NOCs, but all energy companies, to be net zero, the pressure from their stakeholders, their customers and so on, and how you've mentioned it, Faris, about being transparent about what we can and what we can't do. And it'll be interesting to see if there's more of those voices coming back going, we are on board, you just have to bear with us. You know, that it's going to take a bit of time, and doing so in a way that doesn't sound like an excuse and doesn't sound like scapegoating. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how those dynamics play out. Faris, Trung, thank you very much for joining us again. We could go on, there is so much to say. So I think we've covered as much as we can in the time we've got, but thank you very much and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you,
Thanks,
Trung.
Faris.